All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, introducing Samantha Melamed. She is a reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer, and she has this incredible new series out. Well, it really started last month in the Inquirer, and it's called the Homicide Files. It's a 5-part series and a full investigation of many aspects of the murder prosecutions in Philadelphia over the last 40 years and more. Welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing really good. Appreciate you joining us today. So congratulations on this. I kind of feel bad for you that the Pulitzer is so tainted now with this Russiagate stuff because you're sure to win one. But no, you really did a great job on this, and I learned so much, and I spent all morning finishing up the whole series here, and I really encourage people to read it. It's really something else. Can we start with, I guess, just sort of the basic background of how all this got started? It's one of these new progressive prosecutors decided to review some things, or some cases came to a head and then it all sort of unraveled, or what's the background to what all's going on? Oh, and also, I guess, if you could stipulate, how many people have had their convictions overturned so far?
So I want to say right now it's about 20, it's something like 22 people in 23 cases, because one of those people has now been exonerated of 2 separate murder cases and 4 murders in total.
Wow.
So it goes pretty deep.
All right.
The backstory of this actually goes all the way back to the 1970s. At that time, some investigative reporters at the Philadelphia Inquirer had uncovered in a series that they called the Homicide Files, just a rampant abuse in the interrogation rooms at the homicide unit. I mean, to the point that people were being hospitalized, after some of these interrogations. There were a series of reforms that followed, and they did stop severely injuring people in a lot of cases, but it seems like they found other ways to get the statements that they needed to get to close cases. So what happened over the past decade or so is that in 2013, 2014, a police commissioner put in some reforms. He said, you have to tell witnesses that they are free to go, that you can't force them to stay until they give a statement. He said you have to record interrogations. So, when someone confesses, we should know what led up to that confession. And maybe it's a coincidence, maybe it's not, but what we saw was that after those reforms went into place, the clearance rates dropped pretty precipitously. So Philadelphia had one of the nation's highest homicide clearance rates, which means the rate at which that they're solving these cases. It was like 80%, some years like 90%. And right now it's about 43%. So in 2018, District Attorney Larry Krasner came into office. He came in on sort of a reform agenda, saying that the old way of doing things was corrupt, was, not fair, not transparent. I mean, I probably don't have to tell you he's an extremely controversial figure here for many reasons. Because people feel, some people feel like he is, not respecting the work of the police, or is letting criminals off the hook. But one thing he did do was reopen a lot of old cases and take a sort of different approach. He created a really robust conviction integrity unit. and they are charged with reviewing these cases. And what they found is in a lot of cases, really important evidence was hidden illegally. They found evidence of coercion of witnesses. Even before the DA took office, there was a really high profile exoneration of a guy named Anthony Wright, who was cleared by DNA of a rape and murder that took place in 1991. They recharged him. They retried him anyway, even after the DNA came through, and he was and his conviction was overturned and he was acquitted. And now we've just seen a ton of other cases that have followed off and involving some of the same detectives and the same prosecutors.
All right, now on the narrative there about the how out of control it got in the 70s. If I read you right in here, I think you say that they made some reforms in the early 80s, but that really didn't last. And it was kind of most of the horrors we're talking about here in this series take place in the 1990s and 2000s. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think 80s, 90s, 2000s, there was, a series of cases in the early 80s that I wrote about in an article called Sex for Lies, which is what, one person described the scheme to me as, where they were, they said, okay, the stick isn't working, so we'll try the carrot instead. And they were getting these jailhouse informants, people who were incarcerated in the county jail, often facing very serious charges. And they were bringing them down, according to these informants, to the homicide unit, offering them sex, offering them drugs, right there in the police headquarters, if they would participate in framing people for murder. And, right now, one of the men involved in one of those cases, Willie Stokes, the DA just agreed that his conviction should be overturned in federal court. So we're waiting to see what the judge does on that. But so anyway, to answer your question, it's been sort of different detectives have had different tactics. Certainly not everyone. Of course, there are many, many detectives whose names never appear, in my research. So it's, it's hard to say how widespread it is, but it definitely has sort of been, there have been different groups through the 80s, 90s, 2000s. And you may know right now, in January, Detective Philip Nordo is set to go to trial. He was a detective up until, I think, 2017. And he's charged with raping and grooming witnesses and suspects to frame others in murder cases.
So I guess the reforms in the early 80s, they didn't really take, they just kind of adapted.
Yeah.
That was what you're saying about they got in trouble for the stick. So that was when they adopted the carrot there. That was the only real deviation. I see. All right. And now, so I want to emphasize here to the audience that you have so many profiles of so many people. Each one of these things is 5,000 or 10,000 words or something. And you have so many stories of people who were set up here. But, I want to give you a chance to talk about a few of them to make it real and not just statistical. Could you start with this guy, Wright, that you mentioned before?
Yeah. So Tony Wright, like I said, he was arrested in 1991. A woman who was in her 70s, Louise Talley, was, brutally raped and assaulted in her home in North Philadelphia. And they picked up Wright for this case, and it's not entirely clear how they settled on him. But, there were so many pieces of this case that seemed to be for instance, they found the detective said they found this Chicago Bulls shirt in his home that had been worn to the crime scene. And then they found 2 juveniles who they interviewed without their parents present or any adult present, who said that they had seen Wright at the scene with, wearing that shirt. And then when they did DNA testing, they found that the shirt had been worn only by the victim of the crime, not by Wright. So, here's a situation where it seems pretty clear, according to the defense and now according to the DA's office, that the shirt was planted and it never was at his house at all, and the witnesses were coerced. So he's someone who spent decades in prison, and just like really struggled with not only the fact that he was in prison for life, but that he had been categorized as a murderer and rapist, having done this really sort of repulsive and awful crime. And so, like I said, he was exonerated at trial. I think the jury deliberated for about 45 minutes. And they said, he's clearly innocent. And they let him out. And the three detectives who worked on that case are actually now being criminally prosecuted for perjury at his retrial. So
That's amazing. Wow.
yeah, it's a really rare instance because.
And now, did the DNA lead to the actual perpetrator who's been free all these years?
The DNA actually did lead to another person, which again is like you said, that's super rare, that they are able to not just to actually match the DNA to someone else. That was a guy named Ronnie Bird, who had died in prison sort of long before they even made the match. But he was someone who was a drug user who was living in an abandoned property close by. And, I think his name, if I'm not mistaken, has sort of been appeared in the investigation. And then, none of that information, if I'm remembering correctly, none of that information was turned over.
Mm-hmm. And then can you talk a little bit about the 17-year-old girl who has an ironclad alibi that for some reason it just didn't count? And this goes really to the larger question of the coerced confessions and just how well torture works. And you could define torture so broadly as to mean a big fat cop with the stinky bad breath in a small hot room. And that's enough to get anybody to say anything.
Yeah, India Spellman, she was a teenager when she was picked up for a murder that had happened. It was a girl and a boy, or perhaps a woman and a boy, who had robbed a woman at gunpoint and had then robbed another man at gunpoint and ended up shooting and killing that elderly man. And her juvenile co-defendant, who was taken into custody pretty quickly, named India as his co-conspirator. He did so in the presence of a detective, James Pitts, who has been repeatedly accused of coercion, of assaulting people in custody, of targeting juveniles, people, in addiction or with mental illness or otherwise vulnerable, and of fabricating statements. He is still employed by the Philadelphia Police Department, although he is on some sort of desk duty, not in the homicide unit at present, but he's still drawing a paycheck. In any case, India was taken down to the homicide unit. Her father was not allowed in the room with her. Her mother described to me just being downstairs at the front desk, like pleading to be let in. And then the detectives came out and they said, like, no, she's already confessed to this murder. And at the time the murder happened, according to her grandfather, he was at home with her and she was on the computer. And she has cell phone records showing that she was talking on the phone, and she has a friend who has, given statements that she was on the phone. So it's like, and, she was also identified by eyewitnesses in court only, not through like any kind of photo array, not through a lineup, but in court, they said, yes, that's her. Even though she didn't actually match the descriptions that they themselves gave of the perpetrator, because she was, like a skinny, light-skinned 17-year-old girl. And they had described the perpetrator as being heavyset, being dark-skinned, being potentially like in her 20s or 30s. So it was sort of a mismatch. But despite all that, she was convicted by a jury, and her co-defendant
Which, I'm
has
sorry, by the
never.
way, could you slow down for just a sec there? On that
Sure.
part, did her defense attorney get up and do you know this part? Is this part reported about the trial that under cross or under, whatever direct evidence introduction or witness examination, did the defense explain to the jury the cell phone records prove her phone was on the phone with this other 17-year-old girl or so at the same time, and that the cell phone towers indicate she was in her living room and not at the scene of the crime, and how that's science and you can't really get around that because the only other explanation would be that her grandfather was the one on the phone with the 17-year-old girl for an hour and a half that day?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that alibi evidence wasn't presented at the trial.
Wasn't presented at the trial. Was that because the judge excluded the evidence at the trial, or the defense attorney didn't bother, or do you know?
My understanding is that the defense attorney, who's since died, was really someone who had been around for a long time, and was, late in his career, and perhaps like didn't quite have it the way he used to. I mean, there's no real evaluation of, competency of or effectiveness of counsel until you get to the post-conviction,
Right.
appeals, and then those questions come into consideration. But
Sometimes they do, right? But I mean, a lot of times the argument after conviction has to be that, well, there wasn't a fair trial, there was a mistake in the process, or there's a new scientific method that's been developed that we can use to re-examine evidence or something like that, where just saying, well, we have proof of these cell phone records may not be enough to overturn anything at all. If, as you say, her lawyer dropped the ball, that's her team's fault in the eyes of the court, a lot of the times.
Yeah, I mean, I think she is arguing ineffective assistance of counsel, which could be grounds potentially to overturn her case.
I mean, that's
But
pretty ironclad evidence. She's either there or she's not, It's kind of, yeah, one of those.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, it's just one example of so many. In fact, so you mentioned this guy, the detective Pitt, who got this confession out of her. Can you talk about what we know about how he did that? Because you write about that.
So according to India, she wasn't literate. And she, even though she was a teenager and in high school, it's really, unfortunately, not that uncommon in Philadelphia for people, who are sort of interfacing with the system and are in their late teens to say that they actually aren't literate. So, she said that he hit her. She said he threatened her. And ultimately, she said that he simply put a false confession in front of her and told her to sign it. And if she signed it, then she could go home. And she didn't know what it was, according to her. And she asked him to read it to her. And he said no. And she finally, broke down and signed it. And I think, she would say that that's, sort of one of her great regrets. But at the time, she didn't understand the situation. She had never been in trouble before.
Mm-hmm. And then, so what's going on at the prosecutor's office where no matter what kind of garbage cases the police department brings to them, they go ahead and prosecute it anyway?
I mean, obviously that's not how they would sort of interpret it. And, I think,
Well, 22 overturned convictions so far is
yeah,
again, that's science, right? That's not an opinion. That's a quantitative fact at this point, I think.
Going back to Anthony Wright, when I've talked to detectives who worked on that case or to prosecutors, they still think that that Anthony Wright is guilty. That like the DNA really doesn't change their mind. So, I think the DA's office, what type of screening is done in sort of bringing these cases forward is, I agree, like more clarity on that would be helpful. But, a lot of times I think that there's probably a confirmation bias aspect that's happening. There's a sense like this is the person, and it becomes easy to sort of overlook these flaws in the case.
Mm-hmm.
And there's probably also like pressure to close cases, even though a lot of people will deny that. There's, sort of a history of, like a culture of like a bit of a win at all costs culture in the prosecutor's office. And, I think some of these errors, or, you could say that they're errors, or you could say that they're, malicious, but, I think they're sort of a consequence of a culture.
Mm-hmm. Hey, y'all, check out my new book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, at enoughalreadybook.net. Early reviews are that people either think it's hilarious or they get so angry that they put it down. But it's the Iranian Revolution, the 80s Afghan War, the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq War I, Iraq War 1.5, and then Afghanistan, Iraq War II, Somalia, Pakistan, Libya, Syria, Iraq War III, Yemen, and all the special operations wars throughout Africa in the aftermath of the war in Libya. It's all there for you. Might change a friend's mind. Enough Already. Time to End the War on Terrorism at enoughalreadybook.net.
Hey guys, Scott Horton here for expanddesigns.com. Harley Abbott and his crew do an outstanding job designing, building, and maintaining my sites, and they'll do great work for you. You need a new website? Go to expanddesigns.com/Scott and save $500. Hey guys, check out Listen and Think audiobooks. They're at listenandthink.com and, of course, on audible.com. And they feature my book, Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, as well as brand new out Inside Syria by our friend Reese Ehrlich, and a lot of other great books, mostly by libertarians there. Reese might be one exception, but essentially they're all libertarian audiobooks. And here's how you can get a lifetime subscription to Listen and Think audiobooks. Just donate $100 to The Scott Horton Show at scotthorton.org/donate.
Well, if you watch Law and Order, they got to make the show last an hour, right? So in the first 15 or 20 minutes, they got the wrong guy. And then they figure it out and they admit it. They go, oh, whoops, we were mistaken. It's actually this other person is the guy who's guilty, who we want to prosecute. And they're never wrong about who they want to prosecute. And he's always guilty. The only question is whether, by the end of the episode, they get the right guy, at least. The only question is whether he's going to get away with it or not. But it doesn't sound like you have a lot of that here. It's and in fact, this is something that kind of permeates through the series as I read it. When you profile the detectives and the district attorneys in question and all that kind of thing, and I don't think it's just the way you portray it. I think it's really comes through your reporting here that these are not impressive men. This is not the guy who's the star of Law and Order, who's this brilliant genius who follows the clues in all the best ways and figures out exactly the thing. These guys are a bunch of meathead idiots who could basically be a junior high school gym coach or could be, pushing the carts at the grocery store. And instead, they're in charge of solving crimes. And so, they do the job that a 105 IQ murder detective would do, which is find a guy, pin a crime on him, and move on to the next one.
I mean, I'm not going to step into that, but I will say a couple of things. One is that, like, as you alluded to, I think for years there's been sort of a huge deficit in attention to forensic evidence, in attention to sort of like using cell phone technology to verify. Is there sufficient training? I mean, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Reid technique, this sort of method of accusatorial interrogation, where you're potentially reading people's body language to sort of detect deception. I mean, these things are like very out of date. And, are they being trained on, ways to better go about their investigations? Are they being given the tools that they need to do proper forensic investigations? Mm-hmm. I mean, when I went into the police headquarters and I interviewed the captain of Homicide, and I asked him what he's doing to prevent false confessions, he just it was pretty clear that he thought that I was, sort of making something up. And he said, we don't think that that's a problem. And if it were a problem, then recording would solve it. Which, many proponents of recording say it doesn't solve at all, because you can still, you cannot even know. There's a former homicide detective, and now I think consultant James Trainum, who often talks about how he once took a false confession. Mm-hmm. And when he went back and actually watched the video, he realized that he wasn't even doing it intentionally, but he gave, the defendant, all the information that ended up being in that confession. So, like, if they're not even aware of it, how can they possibly be working to prevent it?
Right. And in fact, I followed that link and I read that op-ed, and he talks about too how he had set up all of the incentives as a perfect kind of little maze for her where there's only one exit, and just made it where it just made sense for her to confess in that moment anyway, in her eyes. And then, it's an interesting one where he said later evidence came out that proved just ironclad alibi beyond a shadow of a doubt she was somewhere else and that her confession was just wrong. And it's nice to see somebody even be that honest about it, a DA be that honest about it. But so let me ask you this. There's something that seems to be glaringly missing from your series, but maybe you're just still working on chapter 6 here, which is the judges. Because there can only be a handful of judges in charge of these criminal cases over these decades in this town, overseeing this charade, these people getting railroaded day in and day out like this. And of course, they have absolute immunity from any criminal prosecution. But what about immunity from investigative reporting and at least having to face the shame that all of this happened on their watch and that they're responsible for it?
Yeah. I mean, I do think that, you're probably right. It's sort of complicated because obviously, a lot of these cases are decided by juries. So the judges would probably sort of, and then too, like it becomes a situation where, in so many of these cases, it's like, you have the witness or defendant saying, I was coerced. And then you have the detective coming in and saying like, no, it was voluntary. And now they're probably afraid of the defendant. It's witness intimidation. That's why they're recanting, whatever. So, I think the judges are sort of probably in many cases, feel like, well, it's up to the jury to decide who's telling the truth. And so like suppressing this confession, like the jury, that isn't sort of, it doesn't meet that standard where I know that it's involuntary. I do agree though, it's an interesting question. And, there are certainly some judges in Philadelphia who do have, historically had a reputation, a sort of, perhaps making improper decisions or sort of letting the prosecution run rampant in their courtrooms. But yeah, there's obviously a lot of players involved, whether it's the judges, the, sort of asleep at the wheel, incompetent or underpaid defense lawyers, prosecutors who may be hiding evidence, or of course the police who built the cases in the first place.
Yeah. I think there's a lot to that about the incompetence. I was one time, I admit, a state's witness. I didn't flip on any co-conspirator of mine. I just walked in on an armed robbery at a Quickie Mart, and I did not identify the guy because I did not get that good of a look at his face. I was looking more at the weapon in his hand. So, but I just talked about what I saw there for what it was worth. But I do know that the DA who did the direct examination of me, the ADA, I met her like 2 nights before, told her, what my testimony was going to be, essentially, gave her my side of the story. Then 2 days later, she examines me. And basically, I had to do all the work because she didn't even know how to even get, what she wanted from me on direct. That was All very cut and dry stuff. I walked in, I saw a guy hitting another guy in the head with a stick. You know what I mean? Easy. And then the defense attorney got up, and he also was completely incompetent. And the way that he was trying to get me to contradict himself, he just wasn't even doing a good job at that at all. And I thought, well, this poor schmuck, for all I know, they got the wrong guy. But this idiot isn't going to get him off, you know? And in fact, in the Rittenhouse thing, not to take a side, but just as an example, I saw the prosecution's close and the defense close, not all of them, but most of both. And I think I could have done a better job of both on like the key questions of the parts that they were trying to answer. They were like, meh, and kind of glossing over it and not even really hammering the point home before they move on to the next one. When it was, everything hinges on this question, and they just make it like one of 6 questions when this is the one that it all hinges on. And I'm just thinking, man, this is what happens when you put a camera in a courtroom for a high profile trial, is people see that this is what goes on. Like, this is the best you could get. It's pretty sad, honestly. It's nothing like Matlock or, Law and Order, where all the oak paneling on the wall ensures that everything going on in this room is on the up and up. It just isn't really like that. It's more like a government program like the DMV or something, only with people going to prison for decades.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that sort of is mind-boggling sometimes is when you look at these cases and how little evidence it took for people to be convicted on. And I do think, that might be changing a little bit. Maybe, probably depends where you are in the country. I do think, like in Philadelphia, juries are, not as willing to accept such a thin case now. And they are, not all the time, but, sometimes they are saying like, no, this doesn't smell right to me, or like, what is the actual evidence here? But,
the case of the girl, India, the 17-year-old girl, I think you quote the eyewitness statement said that and the victim statements, right, said that the woman had like a Iranian Muslim veil over her face, or all you could see were her eyes. Heavy set, darker skin from what they could tell. Here's this light-skinned, skinny girl. And then they say at the trial, this is the testimony against her, I'll never forget those eyes. So even think of, just marvel at that the prosecution would put on the stand someone who has already said they could only see the eyes and the rest of the person's face was covered. That they would even put them on the stand as an eyewitness in the first place. You're an eyewitness to eyeballs only. No other facial features at all. But I'll never forget those eyes. And then the jury nods and says, well, she seems sure about those eyes. I mean, that's completely crazy. That sounds like a sitcom or something. And then this girl's in the penitentiary now. And I think you said she's 27 now.
Yeah. I mean, and it's, at the time it was a highly covered case in the media. And, the way, to look back at the news reports, including at the Inquirer, it really was presented as if it was overwhelming evidence. And, and she's, like I said, she's still in prison. She hasn't been exonerated. But when you actually go back and look at the evidence, it's, it does raise really serious questions.
Yeah. Well, and that was going to be my final question too. What about the culpability, the failed responsibility of the Philadelphia Inquirer over the last 45, 50 years that you cover here for all of this happening on their watch, taking the cop's side, taking the DA's side on what it all seems to mean every time at the expense of the innocent civilians you're sworn to protect. And I know you're the one doing a good job, but I mean the rest of them. And I mean going back. And shouldn't that be part 7 of this thing after the judges?
I mean, I think it's a mixed bag. The Inquirer, like I started off the conversation saying, does have a really amazing history of investigative reporting on police misconduct. They were the ones who broke open this story, 40 plus years ago. And, we've seen like a ton of coverage, about, out of the Inquirer, especially from the investigations teams, that has led to, like prosecutions of police who were, for instance, I don't know if you remember there was a squad of narcotics police that were federally prosecuted some years ago after, they were accused of
cutting the CIA out of the deal. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Shaking down, robbing, assaulting, terrorizing people, and they were charged in federal court, and they were all acquitted, and they're back on the job, most of them, as far as I know. So I guess what I would say, and then of course you're absolutely right. I mean, there is certainly in our newspaper, as in newspapers across the country, a long history of what people now call police stenography, which is to say, just taking the word of the police, cultivating those sources, like potentially at the expense of the truth. So, I think I agree. It's a really challenging legacy, and potentially if these stories had been exposed earlier, maybe some people would not have had to do the many years in prison that they've done for crimes they didn't commit. But this is also, it's incredibly difficult reporting. It's incredibly difficult to know, when you're reporting a story where the crux of the story is who lied, trying to find the closest thing you can to the truth of that is really difficult. So it's I agree. It's a legacy that we need to sort of grapple with. And, I don't know if this series is addressing some of that, but it's a really difficult one.
Yeah. I mean, I think using the word claimed instead of said when a government employee speaks from time to time would help a lot, instead of just where the tone built in. And I know this isn't your job editing the paper or whatever, but and this goes for every TV, local TV news channel in America too, and all the papers too, is the government said comes with, because this person is called an official, that means that the words they say are official somehow, and we're just supposed to accept it until proven otherwise. But anytime anybody else says something, you could get acclaimed on that. But when it's the government, then, no. In fact, well, never mind. Anyway, I think you've done a great job on this. I hope that the paper will follow your lead and everyone will be jealous of you and try very hard to, one-up you and do their own series about how corrupt the government is in your city and protect your people from it, because it is obviously the greatest danger to their lives and liberty. So, and congratulations on your Pulitzer in advance if I don't get a chance to talk to you again, because I'm sure you're going to win one for this thing.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
All right, you guys. That is Samantha Melamed, and she is writing at the Philadelphia Inquirer. You got to check this thing out, the Homicide Files. And we have dozens accused, a detective of fabrication and abuse, about James Pitt, Sex for Lies, The Case That Collapsed, and The King of Death Row. This is the first one I read that actually we didn't touch on as much, which is about this prosecutor who kind of oversaw a lot of this as well. That's part 5. This whole thing is just great. Losing Conviction at the Philadelphia Inquirer. And thank you again, Samantha.
Thanks so much.
The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.